So let's talk problems and applications regarding money and banking. Here's the argument. All modern societies specialize in trade, which means we're going to be trading with a bunch of strangers. And that means we need a couple things. The first thing we need is money. Instead of relying on barter, we want to not waste time finding people that have the exact inverse of what we have and need. And so we want money. Right? Money helps alleviate all that time wasted. Another thing we need are loans. We don't always have the cash available when investment opportunities come around, or maybe we need to pay for a daughter's wedding and the cash flow isn't there. There's lots of reasons to borrow money, but a lot of those reasons for borrowing money create economic growth. So we need some system whereby people that have excess savings can find a home for it with people that need borrowing. So lenders and borrowers kind of need each other. Wouldn't it be nice to have somebody, a market where they can meet? Another thing we need is the convenience of somebody to keep our money safe, maybe somebody to issue paper slips called demand deposits or checks so that we don't have to lug gold around with us. We need somebody to process payments for these checks, etc. We need basically what banks are going to offer for us. So we need convenience, loans, money. We or the Fed need an easy way to increase or decrease the money supply. This is monetary policy. Banks offer an easily accessible way to increase or decrease the money supply by a little or a lot every day, and this affects interest rates and can change the economy. And these are all things that the banking system does for us. The banking system is all of the local savings and loans, the local credit unions, the national and global consumer banks, and many more lending institutions. So let's get to those questions. What is meant by fractional reserve banking? What is meant by required reserves? If the required reserve ratio is 18%, what is the required reserve amount from a deposit of $24,000? And here's the solutions. You got $24,000 and multiply it by 18%. $43.20 is what the banks need to hold back. They can loan out the rest. Which of the following is the least liquid? First, get that definition out of the way if you don't already know it. Liquidity is how fast you can spend an asset. More liquid equals faster. So that $100 in cash is pretty liquid. You can spend that right away. How about that treasury bond? You probably need to sell it first to get the cash. You can't just walk up to a Rite Aid and pay in treasury bonds. Money in a savings account. Likewise, it's pretty quickly spendable, but not instantly spendable. You've got to probably transfer it into your demand deposits first, a different account before you can access it with your debit card or whatever. So probably the best answer is a Picasso painting. It's going to take a while. This asset is like frozen almost, right? It has to find a buyer. You've got to actually get the painting sold, etc. But hey, you got a Picasso painting, so. All right, moving into the money multiplier realm. So banks do this thing of fractional reserve banking, and with it, they can loan out money to new people, and that creates new money. We call that the money multiplier. So if you had a higher reserve requirement, would that increase or decrease the money multiplier? What do you think? So let's set it up with sort of the definition of the money multiplier, the inverse of the required reserve ratio. And then let's just pick some numbers here. If the required reserve ratio were to increase, this is the Federal Reserve sets it, from 10% to 20%, what happens? We'll want to look at the money multiplier. So pause for just a minute and work out the problem, and then I will solve it with you. All right, so at 10%, the money multiplier is 1 over 0.1, or 10, and at 20%, it shrinks to 5. Banks are forced to hold more back and therefore to loan out less. And this means that each dollar pumped into the banking system will only create 5 times that much in new money and new loans, whereas before it was creating 10 times as much. Incidentally, 10 is currently the required reserve ratio for most types of checking accounts and most types of banking accounts. Here's a more involved money multiplier question. The Fed wants to shrink the money supply by $100 and the reserve ratio were 20%. By how much should it change the money supply? Go ahead and pause, and then we'll work it out. So once you've got the money multiplier equation set up, it's always the same. You take your initial change times the money multiplier, and that gives you the total change in money supply. We just plug in what we know. So in this case, we know this, and we know this, or can figure it out from the information given in the problem, and we don't know this. So we keep this as a question mark, and we plug in the 0.2 here, so our money multiplier is 5, 1 over 0.2, and we need that to equal 100. So we have this unknown, we'll call it x, times 5 equals 100, so 5x equals 100, rearranging terms slightly, dividing both sides by 5. Whoopsie. Let's divide both sides by 5, and we get x equals 20. So they need to pump in 20, or they need to reduce money supply by $20, and the ripple effects of banks having to reduce their loans, etc., will mean the money supply decreases by 5 times that amount to 100. And here's a question about interest rates. How should we think about interest rates? What is the role of interest rates? They represent the cost of borrowing. When they fall, borrowing and spending rises, or it's a reward for saving. When interest rates rise, savings rise, or both, or neither. All right, so here's the tricky thing. Both A and B are true. The cost of borrowing and a reward for saving. But for our purposes, for macroeconomics, we care so much more about A. So when you think about interest rates, be thinking about interest rates as a cost of borrowing. And so a policy might be that when spending is dropped in a recession, that the policymakers might try to reduce interest rates to make borrowing and spending cheaper for people. That's monetary policy. And here's a question just for your own information. Feel free to look up the OECD's website and look at savings rate and see if you can figure out where the U.S. ranks. Okay, you ready for another adventure? Go to the Fed's website, or alternately, you can go to Fred. That's a little nicer way to find everything. That is a St. Louis Fed who has really good visuals. All right, or you can go to the overall Federal Reserve. Find money supply for M1 and M2, adjusted seasonally. Over the last 12 months, what has happened to M1 and M2? And here's hints if you need. Economic research data, statistical releases. All right, so we're at the Fred website, and you can see we've got a lot of old data here. I'm looking at M2. I just put M2 in the search bar up here. Okay, so let's make this I'm going to pull this little thing over here, so we're only looking at the last few years. Let's make sure we have it all the way to the front. Okay, so you can see during recessions, the money supply goes up. So this is M2, which includes M1. Interesting. During the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we are increasing the money supply. Why do you suppose that is? Well, could it have something to do with interest rates? Sure, let's look at the federal funds rate, which is basically the key short-term interest rate in the economy, the one that the Federal Reserve tries to change. So remember in that beginning of the recession, or beginning of the pandemic rather, which had a recession in it, we saw a big increase in M2. Well, that corresponds with a big decrease in the federal funds rate. So the Federal Reserve is trying to stimulate the economy by getting it cheaper to borrow. And you'll notice that sort of coming up to beginning 2022, we are starting to see the federal funds interest rate rise. So as you might imagine, something is happening with money supply. Next up, we will be talking about exactly how this works, but that's just a little teaser for you.